The original work is entitled Sirāj al-tawārīkh, which means literally the lamp of histories. The translation, which we eventually did, is we call the History of Afghanistan, because indeed it's a full history of Afghanistan. It began, we're not quite sure when, sometime perhaps in the early 20th century, sometime between 1897 and 1905. The author was commissioned by the Emir of Afghanistan, a man named Habibullah Khan, to write a history of Afghanistan. Now, the Emir himself felt he should be the one writing the history, but he was, of course, too busy to do so. So he had asked one of his secretaries, a Hazārah named Fayż Muḥammad, to write the work for him. And that's when the work began. Initially, Fayż Muḥammad wrote a work of history entitled Tuhfat al-Habib, which means gift to Habib. The name of the Emir was Habibullah. And the Emir didn't like it, so he told him to go back and start over, which was when the Sirāj began. I think most of the research he had done and much of the things he'd said, he left out the controversial bits, but he included them all in this Sirāj al-tawārīkh. So that's really how the work began. It was a long process. The author had people looking over his shoulder all the time. It's probably worth backing up a little bit and saying something about who this author was. He was a member of a class in Afghanistan, or an ethnic group in Afghanistan called the Hazārahs. And the Hazārahs have historically been at the bottom of the social ladder. Their origins go back to Genghis Khan, and they believe that they themselves are descended from Genghis Khan, and quite likely they are. They're very Mongoloid appearing, and so they're quite distinctive in Afghanistan. It's very easy generally to tell who's Hazārah and who isn't, not to mention the fact they also adhere to the Shiite form of Islam rather than the Sunni, which puts them into a minority as well. So they're quite a distinct group and sort of at the bottom of the social ladder. Most of the laborers of Afghanistan are made up of Hazārahs. So it's quite unusual to find a man like Fayż Muḥammad in a position that he was in, which was he was working as a secretary. He was quite a good calligrapher, and he wrote letters and documents and so on. And then to have him asked to write the history of the country is also seems on the face of it a little bizarre, but in fact it sort of makes sense because he himself had no particular the Emir thought he had no particular axe to grind, that he didn't represent any political power who might then sort of sway the readership into thinking about who was right and who was wrong on certain issues. So in some respects, it seemed like a good choice. In other respects, it probably wasn't such a good choice because he used the opportunity in the course of writing the history to express many of the grievances that the Hazārahs had against the dominant Pashtuns who ran the country. So this is how the work started. He's got people looking over his shoulder. He has to turn his work in periodically to the Emir to read it and approve it. And so when he started on this particular work, the Sirāj al-tawārīkh, it took him close to a dozen years to get it finally printed. But only the first two volumes. And the first two volumes were less controversial because they began with what's considered the founding of this state of Afghanistan in 1747 and came up only to the beginning of the reign of the Emir's father in 1880. The Emir's father was a noteworthy, I should say perhaps, and notorious ruler who did a great deal by force to reduce the area we now call Afghanistan to the control of a central government. But he's deceased by the time Fayz Muḥammad is writing, but he has to be careful, of course, about what he says about him. So this is really how it begins. So the first two volumes are completed probably by 1910 or 1911 and are then finally printed in 1913. Meanwhile, he's begun work on the third volume, which begins in 1880 when the Emir comes to the throne. The father of the present Emir comes to the throne. And the third volume was to be devoted entirely to that 21-year reign. It turned out to be a very long project because, number one, our author is quite enamored, devoted to the documents that he could find about the period. In fact, at some point, he says that without documents, you can't write history, and everything has to be documented. And so he's writing with this always in mind, and because the Emir was a notorious obsessive, really, micromanager and detail-oriented person, everything is written down and written out, and so the tremendous documentary source to work from. So the book gets bigger and bigger as he's writing it. The Emir, Habibullah, approves his work in segments. It turns out eventually that 92 segments, each one 32 pages long, actually get printed. By this time, it's 1920 or 1921, and his patron, Habibullah, has been assassinated by now. He's assassinated in 1919. He's working under another Emir, a son of Habibullah. And the son isn't quite so enthusiastic about the work, and finally, for a number of reasons, decides he's had enough. And so he suspends the printing of it. So this third volume never is finished in original form, and it lays dormant. There's a rumor, and I'm not quite sure how true it is, that the Emir who ordered the suspension of publication also ordered all. What would happen at the press is they'd print 32 pages and they'd put them in a pile, maybe 200 or 300 copies, and then they'd print another 32 and they'd put them in a pile. And when they had those 92 printed, the story is that the Emir said, burn them all, so nothing survives of this third volume. But in fact, they, either out of carelessness or because it wasn't true in the first place, these were not burned, and people came to the press and salvaged the copies, so some survived. And I was fortunate enough in 1967 to be able to find and buy one of these to find the first two volumes wasn't so difficult, but the third volume was much more difficult. But to get the third volume, and that's when this whole translation project sort of began, I should say. So, but that's that gives you some idea of the original work and how it progressed along very slowly under much supervision, but sort of with the dedicated force behind it of this author, Fayz Muḥammad, who was determined to see that it was finished. So that's the original.